Okay, so I'm just going to check with the team here if everybody's ready to start. And I will need you to close your videos because when the transmission starts, it can leak the little video. But pay attention to the chat on the reunion because I will remind you to open your videos when it's time, okay? So
Okay.
let me check here.
But I can see you, right? So why
Yeah,
don't you,
I'm going to.
are you switching off your
mine
video?
too. Yes,
Okay.
I'm just getting ready here. Thank you.
Ah, tudo certo, Gisele, podemos começar.
Recording in progress.
Boa tarde, todo mundo que está nos assistindo. É sempre uma emoção estar na Unbox, nessa abertura virtual, hoje especialmente com o professor Saurabh Dube, que vai falar conosco desde a cidade do México. Eu quero, antes de começar com uma introdução breve ao professor Saurabh Dube, agradecer especialmente a Mariana Chaguri, que teve essa ideia de trazê-lo para essa sessão especial, a fim de tratar de questões metodológicas nas ciências humanas e, em especial, abrindo o espaço da ciência política, da sociologia e da antropologia para um diálogo também com a história. Para mim, eu me chamo Antonádia Borges e é um prazer imenso estar aqui com o professor Saurabh Dube com vocês, mas, ao mesmo tempo, é uma tarefa bastante difícil apresentar um convidado tão distinto quanto o professor Saurabh Dube, tendo em vista todos os arquivos, né? Esse é um tema, inclusive, forte da pesquisa dele, todos os arquivos que existem a seu respeito, comentários, resenhas, entrevistas e uma infinidade de artigos acadêmicos, livros publicados por ele. Então, eu recomendo a todo mundo, né, que o assista hoje, que siga adiante nessa procura de conhecê-lo melhor. Então, diante disso, né, desse grande desafio, eu preferi fazer um relato muito concreto do nosso encontro, que é um outro tema que mobiliza o professor Dube, o cotidiano em detrimento do espetacular. Eu fui, por um breve período de 2 anos, professora no Colegio de México. Isso faz mais de 10 anos. E lá eu conheci o professor Saurabh Dube e a sua esposa Ishita Banerjee, os dois historiadores com paixão pela antropologia, ambos professores no Centro de Estudos de Ásia e África. Jamais havia conhecido pessoas que navegassem por tantos continentes e disciplinas nas ciências sociais com tanta maestria e criatividade e espírito crítico. A nossa proximidade se estendia também ao fato de sermos vizinhos em Coyoacán, onde o professor Saurabh Dube está sentado agora no seu jardim. Desse cotidiano compartilhado, fui aprendendo a admirar a profundidade desses dois scholars. Saurabh Dube me pediu certa vez que apresentasse a X. Nandi, antes de uma conferência sua no Colegio em 2011. Foi uma lisonja para mim. E à noite, quando nós jantávamos todos na casa da Rua Francisco Sousa, Nandi fez uma ponderação importante. Para ele, havia uma diferença entre intelectuais e acadêmicos. Intelectuais contribuíam para desbaratar o moderno, a modernidade, ou seja, contribuíam para se autodesmontar em suas premissas de conhecimento. Essa, eu diria, tem sido a contribuição crucial do professor Dube, o que o constitui definitivamente como um intelectual, muito mais do que um mero acadêmico. Saurabh Dube tem, em sua numerosa obra, nos convidado a inquirir sobre o papel dos arquivos na constituição do sujeito moderno e das fronteiras, sempre móveis, do que os separam dos vários outros que desafiam, tripudiam, ignoram e até mesmo desbancam a modernidade. Assim, ele interpela a história e a antropologia como disciplinas. No Brasil, especialmente na antropologia, temos alguma familiaridade com o Sudeste Asiático e mais de perto com a Índia, por meio de algumas leituras. Eu falo aqui desde a Louis Dumont até os estudos subalternos, dos quais a mais destacada é Gayatri Spivak. Também conhecemos o trabalho etnográfico de Vina Das e suas respectivas proposições filosóficas. Na esteira do que essa geração dos estudos subalternos produziu e de seus anseios, Saurabh Dube e outros se deparam com um país, a Índia, que ora se afasta, ora se aproxima do ideário de Ambedkar, da política e da estética Dalit, da plutocracia hindutva, do avanço desenvolvimentista e islamofóbico do Partido do Povo Indiano, da perniciosa política de relações exteriores do reeleito Narendra Modi, tão central para esse outro ente que chamamos de BRICS, da resistência das chamadas tribos ao avanço sobre seus territórios ancestrais. Enfim, não há estabilidade, não há completude, e tampouco seriam os subalternos reminiscências de um tempo passado. Diante dessa tessitura complexa, Saurabh Dube não se deixa desviar por fórmulas fáceis. Sua contribuição para refletirmos sobre o que se convencionou classificar como sul global é inestimável. Destaco de seus últimos livros uma série de meditações em conversa com Dipesh Chakrabarty. Suas mais recentes pesquisas incluem ainda um mergulho íntimo em um grupo de dirigentes de elite com os quais cruzou o caminho quando fazendo sua graduação em História no St. Stephen's College, em Delhi. Essa proximidade longínqua em relação aos seus colegas de turma permite a Saurabh Dube uma análise fina sobre a figura do privilégio na constituição do moderno, o que ele chama de sentimento de entitlement, de natureza plástica, que sai dos domínios da religião ou da casta e se molda em paisagens supostas como laicas e meritocráticas, revelando assim as hierarquias da modernidade. Ambos os pais de Saurabh eram antropólogos. Sua mãe, Lila Dube, uma autora feminista de grande envergadura. Saurabh não só herdou de seus pais o gosto por uma disciplina, a antropologia, mas um pensamento crítico e uma capacidade de atravessar tempos e fronteiras, Ásia, Europa, América, sempre atento ao que não é totalmente capturado, ao que desafia as narrativas hegemônicas, especialmente a narrativa hegemônica que aposta na fatalidade da modernidade, tanto no sentido de ser avassaladora, quanto no de ser incontornável. Atualmente, o professor Dube é Research Fellow do Fórum Max Weber para Estudos Asiáticos, que é parte da Fundação Max Weber. A palestra que ele fará hoje se insere no âmbito desse mais recente projeto. Seu título é Verdades, inquietantes, arquivos, histórias, antropologias. Nela, o professor Dube resgata narrativas pessoais, crônicas e vinhetas que revelam seu percurso em busca de compreensões criativas de arquivos e disciplinas, de tempo e espaço, de modernidade e identidade, de história e etnografia. Ele coloca em questão não situações, mas o que chama de insinuações, que são simultaneamente familiares e estranhas. Por esse caminho, busca pensar através da atividade habitual do arquivo e da prática, da disciplina e do sujeito. Seus esforços para desaprender e aprender questionam nossas próprias noções de estranheza e familiaridade, extremamente necessárias no tempo presente, nesse planeta que é um só tempo abrasador ardente, derretido, gelado, já inundado e afundar-se, em suas palavras. Em suma, trata-se de um convite, de uma meditação sobre esses vários mundos, nossos mundos, inundados pela precariedade e pelo privilégio. Muito bem-vindo, professor Saurabh. Welcome to Unbox. We are delighted to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonádia. So it's a pleasure and privilege to deliver this lecture. I thank Mariana and Anpox for the honor of this invitation. It's a special joy to have had Antonádia, a wonderful friend and a marvelous colleague, introduce me today. Obrigado, muchas gracias, many thanks. My talk is called Unsettling Truths, Archives, Histories, Anthropologies. It consists of personal narratives. The tales unravel how I arrived at inklings and understandings of archives and disciplines, of time and space, of modernity and identity, of history and ethnography. At stake are intimations that are at once familiar and strange. Poor, born to anthropologists' parents, I grew up in Sagar, central India, Delhi, old and new, and Simla, or Shimla now. Simla is what the imperial regime called it. My formative years were imbued with the lingering sense of how time spaces of the vernacular and the cosmopolitan ever overlapped, yet also only met each other in curious, quirky, and contradictory ways. A little later, seeking my vocation in research and writing, I was trained in history, but drawn toward anthropology, especially as I cut my apprentice scholar or pre-apprentice scholar teeth on subaltern studies. The story has done the rounds, but it bears another telling. During the second half of the 1970s, a small group of enthusiastic younger historians of South Asia, several of them then in England, held a series of meetings with a distinguished senior scholar of colonial India, Ranjit Guha, who taught history at the University of Sussex. Those who met thus shared a mutual political sensibility born of the events surrounding 1968 and the Maoist Naxalbari movement in eastern India. Their spirit was sustained by the radicalism of the 1970s, sharpened by the police and administrative excesses that marked the state of political emergency between 1975 and 1977 in India. The purpose of these discussions in England and India was to thrash out, a new agenda for the historiography of the subcontinent, an agenda that recognized the centrality of subordinate groups in the making of history. These groups, referred to as subalterns, were seen as rightful but disinherited protagonists in the construction of the past. The idea was to thereby redress the elitist imbalance of much of the writing of history and the social sciences. Thus, subaltern studies was born. Actually, from the latter half of the 1970s, critical departures were afoot in the history of the subcontinent. Especially important were imaginative readings of historical materials, from conventional archival records, including reports of colonial administrators, through to earlier ethnographies as sources of history, and from previously maligned vernacular registers of history through to diverse subaltern expressions of the past. Such readings could problematize the very nature of the historical archive, as well as initiate conversations with other orientations, including those of structural linguistics and critical theory. No less salient were incipient acknowledgements of the innately political character of history writing. In this wider scenario, attending the History Honors undergraduate program in St. Stephen's College in the early 1980s, several of my cohort and I were insinuated in the intellectual excitement that surrounded the emergence of subaltern studies. Soon, pursuing a master's in modern history, also in Delhi University, the debates and ferment of those times led to wider critical engagements with historiographical and theoretical currents underway. Here, even as subaltern studies powerfully pointed us in newer historical directions, the endeavor also appeared as a little skewed. It privileged the spectacular moments of the subalterns' overt rebellions over these groups' more routine, everyday negotiations of power. This suggested, in turn, inadequate, abbreviated articulations of culture and consciousness, of religion and caste within the project. Unsurprisingly, seeking a research theme, I was interested in studying the conduct of resistance in a religious idiom. I'm speaking of language of the mid-1980s. At stake was the manner in which the institutions and imaginings of caste, the practices and processes of Hinduism, dominant and popular, could critically structure and shape the actions and expressions of subordinate communities. For a subject of study, I chanced upon a very heretical and very untouchable Dalit caste set, the Satnamis of Chhattisgarh. The auspices of my parents proved important here, both having conducted ages ago their doctoral research in this large linguistic and cultural region in Middle India. Working towards an anthropological history of the Satnamis, the potentialities and problems of subaltern studies came to the fore. On the one hand, the analyses within the endeavor located the actions of these groups as entirely contemporaneous with the time-space of the British colony and the Indian nation. Thus, in his writings about the peasant insurgent in 19th century India, Guha rendered this historical subject as completely a co-constituent of processes of politics under colonialism. On the other hand, the sensibilities of a recuperative paternalism meant that within the project, the meanings and motivations of these peoples appeared sieved through the master distinction, the master opposition between community and state. The subalterns thus inhabited also a distinct, prior, a priori time. This temporality turned on an implicitly unchanging tradition, shaped by the dead hand of ruling culture. Thus, it was only when these subordinate groups claimed the essence of their initiatives in total insurgency that they emerged at the cutting edge of modern politics. Of course, I did not experience or express matters in quite this manner, but the intimations of the uncertainty haunted, a shadowy presence. Indeed, far from being disabling, the ambiguity was productive. A sign of the times, the tension was fruitful. Now, alongside other theoretical tendencies, I critically engaged subaltern studies. Here, I built on their sensibilities that placed dispossessed protagonists as being formatively a part of history and culture. But I also queried their emphases that presented these subjects as being uncertainly out of time. Thus, seeking to understand Satnami articulations of the past, centered on their gurus, that is, their preceptors, I found in the group's myths a modality of historical consciousness. This historical consciousness elaborated distinct conventions. Here were to be found procedures that accessed and exceeded Brahmanical, kingly, and popular devotional configurations, but also imperial and nationalist representations. Quite simply, Satnami conceptions of the past were entirely coeval with modern historiography, even holding a mirror up to the latter's conceits. They were not another exotic exception. In hindsight, I was exploring processes that braided together time, space, and their enmeshments. I had discovered not only the paucity, but the perversity of the archive. I had found also the predilections and plenitudes of the archive. And so on to another vignette. In the summer of 1868, the Reverend Oscar Law of the German Evangelical Mission Society initiated mission work in Chhattisgarh, drawn to the region by the Satnamis. Law's preliminary inquiries had revealed that the Satnamis were heathens with a difference. They were a monotheistic group whose creed was opposed to idolatry and caste. To the missionary, this was a providential connection, willed by the Lord. I'll just take half a minute. There's a plane passing by, so I can't hear myself. Okay. So the Satnamis were a monotheistic group whose creed was opposed to idolatry and caste. To the missionary, this was a providential connection, willed by the Lord. Would it be long before the deliverance of the flock, once it witnessed the Savior? Yet the Satnamis did not accept the arrival of the millennium. Declining its destiny, the community proved to be elusive for projects of conversion to Christianity. In recent years, we've had forceful reminders that the Western man did not always command the initiative in processes of cultural encounter. In the autumn of 1868, Oscar Law visited the Satnami Guru at his home in Bhandar during the community's annual festival. The missionary described in detail how he sat next to the Guru, was served refreshments there. He made the triumphant revelation to a great mass of Satnamis that the real Satyanam, true name, was Jesus Christ. Elated by the warm welcome, Lord ventured inadvertently into the realm of ethnographic representations, the pursuit of indigenous meanings. He stated that the Satnamis had stroked his beard to show him great honor and affection in their traditional way. Missionary Hype went on to see in the event monumental historical significance. But was the stroking of Law's long flowing beard really the enactment of a timeless, mysterious, and customary ritual? Or was it a mere display of Satnami curiosity? Was the serving of refreshments to the missionary by the Guru an expression of deference to a white sahib, a white master? You know, Lord was possibly the first white person this community had seen. Many in the community had seen. Alternatively, did this extension of hospitality follow a different logic? Did it signify, quote, the moral and conceptual subordination of the guest to the host, as Michael Hersfeld argued in another context? To the hundreds of Satnamis gathered in Bhandar, had Law's visit on the day of Guru's worship unwittingly signified the missionary's acceptance of a subordinate role within the domain of the Guru's authority? 3 months later, the missionary unknowingly challenged a key principle of faith, the wearing of the sacred thread, which is very subversive within Satnam Panth. The curiosity of the Satnamis did not lead to their conversion to Christianity. The hospitality of the community now replaced its hostility. The millenarian hopes of Law lay in ruins. The Satnamis became wary of the missionary enterprise. The evangelists continued to toil the field and to sow the seeds of faith. The halting enterprise of conversion gradually grew through ties of kinship and the prospects of a better life under the paternalist economy of mission stations. Over the next few decades, the missionary enterprise in the region expanded. Missionaries of other denominations, the American and General Conference Mennonites, the Disciples of Christ, the Methodists, the Pentecostal bands of the world, joined members of the German Evangelical Mission Society. There were moves to work with different communities. the converts continued to understand missionary injunctions and to interpret Christian truths through the filters of regional vernacular cultures. The harvest was never bountiful. The harvest was very curious. The missionaries tended, the missionaries reaped. If they made headway, they also had to retrace their steps. Perversely, I had found another set of incredible archives in St. Louis, Missouri, Goshen, Indiana, Newton, Kansas, and other elsewhere such as Tennessee and New Jersey in the US. I'm suggesting, of course, that stories of the remotest of pasts have their beginnings in recent tales. During another dull and dusty summer in central India, I was an optimistic youth, hopelessly haunting the local judicial record office in the city of Raipur. My search was for records that detailed the working out of conflicts between lower caste Satnami tenants and upper caste landlords in the Chhattisgarh region in the late 19th century. It was a characteristically, typically naive thing to do on my part. Almost 100 years ago, the imperial government had destroyed these records. Now, as all prospects appeared lost, I met Sattar, a Muslim from Maharashtra who had settled in Raipur. Sattar worked in the record office as a peon. Now, Sattar was not a good Muslim. He was a lush, a drunk. By 11 in the morning, he was pleasantly high. By 1 in the afternoon, reasonably and sometimes unreasonably drunk. And 3 hours later, he was lost to the world. I'd seen him earlier when I first walked into the records office. Then, as I pleaded in vain to be allowed one look at the countless yellow-gray files lying in endless unhappy piles. Finally, when my face had fallen completely, totally, irrevocably. On each occasion, poised strategically on a landing close by, Sattar had uttered the same sequence of sardonic sounds. Here was a sigh, followed by silence, and then the laconic lament. Or kakaris, what else to do? Very existential. An earnest researcher, I had paid little attention to this funny but sad man, an anonymous alcoholic. All this was to change that hot Friday afternoon when I stood near the records office waiting for a bus, a rickshaw, or a tempo, anything that would carry me away from the dashed desires, anything that would carry me away, any vehicle that would carry me away from the dashed desires turned to rubble, scattered at my feet and everywhere I looked. Sattar walked up, staggering a little, leaned over, and whispered confidentially, quote, "There are records inside about murder, rap, as he put it, murder. By rape, Sattar had meant illicit sexual relationships." The moment of high drama ended. Sattar retreated into himself, then sighed, fell silent, and inevitably announced, "Or kakaris." Yet my chase had begun. The many complicated dealings with Bade Babu, the cynical Brahmin high priest of the records office that gained me access and then permission to photocopy the records over several months, is a tale within the tale. It is best reserved for another time. The point is, Sattar had led me to an ethnographic historian's gold mine. Thousands upon thousands of pages of material on conflicts and the disputing process, often involving mayhem and murder between members of families and clans. Thousands upon thousands of pages of material on conflicts and the disputing process, often involving mayhem and murder between members of families and clans, castes and communities in 20th century colonial Chhattisgarh. Routinely, the records should have met their end several decades ago. Save because of an administrative mistake, administrative bungling, they have suggested a large project on the interplay of official state conceptions and community popular contentions of crime and criminality, legality and property, authority and morality, including rival constructions of the person. The records contain village stories, tales of transgressions and enmities, kinship and neighborhood, gender and age, authority and honor, caste and boundaries, witchcraft and infanticide, and of course, gender and sexuality. On offer is an archive. On offer is an archive of the complex interchange of everyday norms, familiar desires, and alien legalities, the reciprocal determinations of imperial law and village life. That is modernity and subordinity. That is modernity and subordinity on the ground. Sattar, I believe, retired long ago. I'm sure he's dead by now. Put differently, as it is sometimes said in Chhattisgarh, ab wo tired ho gaya hai. He has retired now, or he has tired now. Yet, I continue to work with a boon, the knowledge of a secret which Sattar granted me. Let me then dedicate this talk to Sattar, my comrade and co-conspirator. Is this dedication theatrical? Is this dedication perverse? I'm quite certain what Sattar would have said. Aur ka karis, what else to do? Another archive, lost and found. There's an expressionist and Dalit artist, possibly the most prominent, called Savi Savarkar. I first met Savi in the late autumn of 1999. I did not know him nor his work. It was an entirely unexpected encounter at a party celebrating Diwali or Deepavali, the festival of lights, in the bright premises of the Indian Embassy in Mexico City. As well-dressed women and smartly spruced men came and went, in an open arena and enclosed rooms, speaking of friends and family, a dark man in casual clothes walked up to me. He was a little uncertain, a trifle diffident. I was sitting, inhabiting a quiet corner, fleeing, running away from the fiesta. He introduced himself as Savi, an artist who had recently arrived on an exchange program between the Mexican and Indian governments. As Savi and I talked, our mutual interests in cultural politics and political cultures of caste and untouchability. As Savi and I talked, our mutual interests in cultural politics and political cultures of caste and untouchability became palpable. In what seemed as little more than moments, the traces of Savi's diffidence disappeared, and I no longer wanted to run away from the party. Indeed, Savi soon reached into his satchel, never far from hand, and produced a striking catalogue from a recent exhibition of his work. Even a casual glance through the catalogue was enough to establish that Savi himself was Dalit, the lowest in the caste hierarchy, and that his work embodied a profound challenge to established procedures of art in India and beyond. Not surprisingly, our first meeting has led to several subsequent encounters and entanglements. Blending the personal and the professional, these trysts have resulted in an abiding friendship that has grown over time. That friendship is itself an archive which keeps growing, which keeps proliferating, as I not only continue to write in Savi, but also use his work on the covers of books. Our last vignette. There are times in life when it is impossible to find anew affect and understanding without losing prior beliefs and certainties. Well over a decade ago, as dementia extolled its cost, light was slowly fading from my mother's eyes. Alongside, in the wake of the global economic crisis that began in 2008, the so-called 1%, actually the plutocratic 0.1%, announced themselves across latitudes and longitudes as the doers and undoers of relentless capital, the world, the globe, the planet. Possibly it was this conjunction of the impending death of the remaining parent alongside the growing salience of an entitled elite that led me to a curious research project, namely a study of my own high school cohort, principally subjects of privilege, a return journey of sorts a return journey of sorts to childhood and adolescence, innocence and its absence, the past and the present. The archives are amazing, from Facebook photographs to sociable and even wildish times with the cohort, including having some of the cohort stay at our home in Mexico and meeting them in Delhi and New York and London. Incredibly, that project has expanded to cover many more modern subjects, also subjects of affect and entitlement, friendship and prejudice, memory and hierarchy, gender and
Saurabh, we lost you.
Surprisingly, unsurprisingly, university. Can you hear me?
No, Saurabh, we lost you. If you could come, just
Can you
go
hear
back.
me?
Yeah, now I can hear you fine, but we lost you for a while. So you were just talking about your friends from your college, and if you could go back. The last sentence we could hear from you was about the amazing archive you found on Facebook pages and the time you spent together.
Okay. Yeah. So, but before that, everything was fine, right? So I start from there. The archive, can you hear me now?
Perfectly now, yes.
You know what? I'm actually just going to go. Yeah, okay. So the archives are amazing, from Facebook photographs to sociable and even wildish times with the cohort, including having some stay at our home in Mexico and meeting many, many others in New York, in London, in other cities around. Incredibly, that project has expanded to cover many more modern subjects, also subjects of affect and entitlement, friendship and prejudice, memory and hierarchy, sexuality and gender, all inhabiting places of prerogative. Unsurprisingly, at stake equally are the terms of privilege that course through my own routine life worlds, of academic entitlement, of cultural capital, of professorial privilege, long glimpsed but now charged with a discrete force, a distinct gravity. Here are arenas where university presidents and academic regents, ambassadors and diplomats increasingly come to imagine themselves in the likeness of the plutocratic untouchable set, albeit with relentless wealth and its command substituted by institutional authority and its arrogance. Throughout, conjoining fieldwork and homework. Let's not forget, fieldwork comes from anthropology. This is a project about school. Throughout, conjoining fieldwork and homework, my instinctive, routine ethnographies of the academic and the intellectual everyday have betokened other verities, other truths. To wit, the very smell and sniffing of privilege in hierarchy insinuate anxieties of entitlement. I'll repeat that. To wit, the very smell and sniffing of privilege and hierarchy insinuate anxieties of entitlement and authority, which often rise with heightened mediocrity and connected conceits. Such are the disagreeable quotidian worlds in which this talk was written. But we should not forget that the provocations of these domains have also led me in curious keys to other overlapping truths. The point is that longing and loss undo older truths and instate unsettling actualities, new histories, newer archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saurabh.
I hope I was in time.
Yes, yes, we have plenty of time. I'm wondering if we have some questions on YouTube for you. Probably we do, but I'll take my privilege, as you were saying, of being here.
Nadia, can you just give me half a minute?
Yes,
you
sure.
just give me half a minute? I think I'll go inside because the outside. I'll just take a second. Huh?
Okay.
Yes, you can start. I'm coming in.
Okay. Saurabh, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the distinction you made at the end of your conference between you. Yeah, sorry.
The distinction between.
Yeah, between your relationship to your old friends from your college time and what you met when you found Satar or Savi. There is something about this construction of hierarchy in the ethnographic work and the relation you established before with the subaltern studies. So I think you bring an interesting point here to understand how your relationship to Satar or to Savi didn't start at a point that you consider them hierarchically inferior to you. At the same point as you don't take for granted that you are inferior to your colleagues. So you turn around these common tables of relationship and how do you address another person as a being of knowledge, independently of his caste or his class? How do you engage critically, but also passionately with someone who you are taking into consideration as a researcher himself, like the case of Satar? No, he was a Muslim. He was not a Dalit, but he was a man who used his hands to do the archival work, and he knew the archive was there. As Savi is a man who uses his hands to do these amazing paintings. So there is something about some tactical, the idea of touching and the untouchability, and also the untouchability of the elite. So the fact that they are so far removed from our world. And in the academic world, this idea that we are part of an elite, but at the same time, we are completely relying on an extractivism that you avoid in your work. So I wish you could just go further on this question.
So that's an I'll take it as a constructive critical comment, and it's absolutely fabulous. I think it was about a certain kind of going back to Satar, and Satar came in as almost a kind of a spectral figure. He tells me, he gives me this, this incredible sort of prestation, this knowledge of what was obviously a public secret. And then, I work in the archives, I carry away, I'm allowed to carry away the records and make photocopies. Photocopies is very expensive in the late 80s. But Satar just sort of haunts the place, spectre in the sense that he haunts the place. And, when I, in writing what I have written, it was an enormous, how should I put it? It was an enormous debt that I was acknowledging. And it is, now that you mention it, I'd never thought about the fact that haven't looked at Satar, or certainly not Savi, in any kind of hierarchical way. But I think it was tied to the point which I was making. In the hierarchical mappings of time and space of subaltern subjects, when you place them as behind you in time, when you don't see the the coeval existence of these subjects, that's when the hierarchies are being marked. And in some senses, the kind of what we can call the recuperative, uncritical paternalism of subaltern studies, they were celebrating the subaltern, but placing them in a prior time. So all this, I guess, all this was about, in relation to Sattar, all this is about the fact that, it's not about a modern colonial law, which is ahead of village traditional legalities. They meet again and again, and Sattar was literate. He'd read the stuff, at least the stuff in, he would have read it in Hindi. So what he told me about the records, the way he described them, he had understood. He'd understood what I was looking for, right? Which the others had not, the cynical Brahmin high priest, because, he knew about it, but I was cramping his style. You see, the people who come to the record office there, they come for maps around property disputes. Now, when someone drops the map for you, they can't do it. When someone draws the map for you, you obviously give the denizens of the office, beginning with the person who is on top, money, right? I mean, they're not dodos like me. I went carrying a gift of sweets, and these people virtually sort of slap themselves in the forehead. I mean, what a fool. Why do we need sweets, if you want something more substantial like money? So I think the project itself is unraveled in terms of the in terms of what I refer to as the interpenetration and the entanglements of these different kinds of legalities, where one is not behind and the other is not, And I think it's the spirit of Sattar which informs that. Savi, it was very, very personal. And there's a question of my, looking down in any way at him, because he introduced me to another world. He totally introduced me to another world. And I hadn't thought of working. I was interested. I've been interested in art. I've been interested in, enormously influenced by Hieronymus Bosch and Goya and Bruegel and so on and so forth, so sort of the Lupi Picasso and so on. This was, I never thought of writing about it. It's something which you savor. Now, what happened was that, a very senior colleague who shall remain, who shall not be mentioned, he and his wife went with us, Ishita and me, to visit Savi's place, And Savi has the figure of the Dalit, of the untouchable, bearing these large pots which carry the Hindu swastika and the Hindu Om, because these are signs which were insignia of the subordination of the Dalits. So the idea was that, they carried these pots so that they spat, the Dalit, the untouchable, spat into the pot so that it wouldn't accidentally pollute an upper or middle class class person. So my senior colleague, very senior, very distinguished, you know him, or you knew him, he asked, but why are you making the pots so large, right? They were not meant to be that large. Now, Savi didn't really have an answer, but it's very obvious. If in some senses, one of the focal points of the canvas are these pots, you make them that tiny, would anyone even notice them? If you make them that tiny, would the Om and the swastika, the Hindu swastika, would it stand out, right? And that's when I said, what kind of literalism is there, in the academic world, that you want to do everything in terms of a certain, not just realism, a relentless realism, but an extraordinary literalism. And, that's when I started writing him. So there's never been a question. There's so much to learn from. And in fact, I have a notion that, Savi, he paints. but when he talks, his words are also very important to address, because he comes up with another kind of literalism. This is a literalism of a hermeneutic sensibility. Like Ishita and I participated in a scam. He did a master's in Academia San Carlos. Okay, there was great respect for him, but he didn't finish the thesis. He went away, then he came back. Now, he was staying with us. While Savi went around seeing exhibition, going to Guadalajara, who was writing his thesis? Ishita, me, and research assistants. Now, people would say this is a fraud, but it wasn't. He paints, But one of the things which he did was he came up with his understanding of how caste functioned. So I said, where did you get this information? Okay. So he said, I heard that this is what Baba Sahib, that is B.R. Ambedkar, said. So that's the profound, literalism, which is about a hermeneutic sensibility, and it opens us to the different verities, to the different ways of imagining and coming to truth. Okay, and that's what gets me to the last point. So you said that I don't consider my inferior to the rich guys. They're not all like so rich, but a lot of them are. There was never a question of inferiority, because I wouldn't say I felt superior, but I belonged to the sort of alternative guys who ran the school magazine. I sort of floated around. I never quite related to what the hype was about modern school. I mean, I just couldn't get it, right? I mean, my background comes from elsewhere. So, but there are two things which happen when I was studying them. One is privilege and power. We can sniff at it, as academics, but we don't recognize how it pervades our lives. So one thing which I understood was that, okay, I'm talking about, entitlement and privilege and affect and memory, where, entitlement, it's not as if entitlement and privilege are bad and affect and memory and friendship are good. They all beget each other. So how are we to, understand these entanglements? Ishita, your dear friend, she said, how can you even, when I was telling her some of the stories, she said, how can you even bear these people? And my point was, they exist. They're a part of the world. You may not like them, but that doesn't make them go away. We might abhor Mr. Modi and Mr. Trump and, and various unsavory characters, but they are, they're large, they're enormous, and they are about the perversions and the perversities of power which abound in our worlds. So what about the hierarchies which we play out in academic worlds? But so that's, I said, I've got to look at, I grew up in an academic family. For God's sake, I have to address the privilege in my own life. But, just to add, there's another story which interweaves with these different forms of privilege and so on, which is Savi is the contrapuntal figure in the in this ethnography or contemporary historical anthropology. Does that make sense? So I never considered my inferior, but the subjects is inferior. But I do think they point towards ways of being which also need to be understood.
Yeah, there is a question from the floor.
Yes.
Asking exactly which would be the privilege that you are describing about the academic life. It comes from Daniele Queiroz. Daniele wants to know more about it. And I was just wondering if you could go back as well to this question of ethnographic representation that Oscar Lohr, he kind of, the missionary you mentioned in your talk.
Yeah.
He kind of behaved like an anthropologist, like an amateur, And so in a certain way, you also do an ethnography of the academia when
Yes.
you when you talk about those privileges and those professorial privileges, no? So
Yes.
What can you bring, especially Saurabh, because you are, as I said in my presentation, you navigate between continents. No, you go to Europe very often. You are in America, I mean North America, but also Mexico and South Asia. So are there different kinds of privilege, or is this more like a conceptual key to understand contemporary universities and our role in this in contemporary times?
Yeah, no, I'll actually answer Daniele, her question. I'm interested in the privilege and entitlement of lifestyles, but also of argument of how we hold on to our own, certainties as something which is pervasive, as something which is not just about arguments, cerebral arguments. It's very much about colors, sounds. It's very much about preening and pretense. Okay, so let me just say this. Antonádia is there. I work at an institution which claims to be, the best of the best, right? So how do people go about proving that they are the best of the best, that they are so exceptional? And yet, how does that exceptionalism beget an incredible mediocrity? And, mediocrity is not something which is just bad. I don't like it. But mediocrity is of the world. It exists. Again, it exists with its sensibilities, its colors, its textures, right? So let me, I was in New York last weekend for this conference on global racisms at Columbia. And I met very fine people. There were some very good papers. There were some very disappointing papers. But the main thing was, and this is partly answering your question, Daniele, the main thing was I was left kind of, really shaken, because I've been in those worlds and so on. But I think something's changed about academic worlds as some, precisely in tune with what is changing outside. I mean, this is these are terrible worlds. These are terrible times, global racisms, What I found was, an enormous amount of pretension and preening. The way people walked, the way they made their arguments. I mean, get real. You're talking about global racisms, Trump Tower is not that far away. You're talking about, I mean, you can criticize, the New York Times, which is fine, but the New York Times does report on the horrors which exist, okay? I mean, they whitewash stuff and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, that's the sort of pretense and absolute self-certainty, and it follows on certain kinds of assumption, right? So let me just go to, in the broadest level, what I'm trying to understand through all these projects are the wide implications in the present, even as we look at the past, the wide implications in the present for the contentions and contradictions of modernity and its disciplines. For the contentions and contradictions of disciplines of modernity as accessing and exceeding race and desire, their incitements and enticements. Now, we can take up some of these questions, but I want to end then with four questions. I mean, this part of the discussion. First, is it possible to critically unravel authority, to prudently probe power, without turning these into already totalized dystopias, okay? Registering rather their intimate hauntings, their phantasmic habitations of soul and substance. Second, can we abide with critical difference yet without separating it from power, such that we desist from, such that we do not indolently unconnect a priori alterity from always distant authority. Third, can we take up such tasks with skepticism towards aggrandizement of theory as usual, in order to keep in view instead the imagining of the unimaginable in routine worlds, the imagining of the unimaginable in routine worlds for good and bad, for better and worse, as the radical Durkheim had hinted once. Fourth and finally, and this I'm coming to the crux of the matter, fourth and finally, what happens in such scenarios to the restless seductions of scholarly entitlement, professorial privilege, epistemic practice, and their intricate interweaving? What becomes of us and others in the corporate university and the statist academe, liberal and illiberal, neoliberal and non-liberal, announcing different shades and discrete stripes? So it's something of an answer. It's not, but I'm suggesting, horizons which haunt me, and they're very much about substance. They're very much about sensibilities. They're very much, I just came back so exhausted from this thing, from these meetings, and it was not the ideas, but the way in which they were expressed. I hope this is.
Yeah, Saurabh, what you just mentioned now about pretense and self-certainty, do you think the Dalit artist or the plutocratic elite member, the 0.1%, as you mentioned in your talk, don't you think that they share a kind of a despise for the academia in this performance? You were talking about how Sagi came to his writing in a very how can I say, not direct way, but he paints, you say. So and of course professorial privileged people can't do art in this sense. So there is something about that. And I was wondering if you could connect this this sensibility you have towards this performance of privilege to your avoidance to a priori slots. In your presentation, you talked a lot about, and now you said we should imagine beyond theory as usual, and you mentioned imagination, but also fabulation as a way to address the archive, as a way to address the present. So how do you connect the lack of art, an artistical sensibility in the academic world nowadays, and maybe this kind of choice for this empty, void performance?
Yeah, no, I mean, so, it's, you've got the point, What I don't like is this absolute self-certainty about the cerebral, which is where soul and substance come in, which is where colors and smells come in. What happens to those worlds? Now, Savi, in that sense, is very interesting. He taught at the Delhi College of Art, okay, which is a part of Delhi University. It's another matter that they threw him out on trumped-up charges. But what he taught was with his hands, again, with his, with his imagination, he taught people how to draw. He taught people, as he did his own work. He's so prolific that part of the dislike was for that. The other part of the dislike was clearly, he's radically Dalit. He challenges established procedures of art, but he also paints a lot. So, the Hindu right absolutely despises him. Okay, and the entire move of throwing him out, was at the behest of the Hindu right, and the lieutenant governor of Delhi, the primary administrator, giving the orders. So it goes up very high in the political hierarchies, in the political structures of power. But where I'm going with this is the, the cerebral, the privileging of the cerebral, okay, which comes so naturally, is something which needs to be queried. And it needs to be queried, if I may say so, by not taking ourselves that seriously. And I see that sensibility in your questions, by not taking ourselves so seriously, by, querying our own presumptions, by not thinking that, that what the most recent and the most brilliant sort of formulation that we have, or fabulation which we have, actually answers the world's questions. And that is an aspect of academe. I'm not saying it's true of all academe, but these forms of, these attributes of privilege, of entitlement, of enactment, of acting out, of the deals which are made, of hiding from your own mediocrity. There are these dark worlds of academe. And, I'm speaking of my own center. It's difficult to live with. I've withdrawn. So, this is not just an answer about, this is not just an answer about something which is distant, which I'm studying than earlier. I'm not, it's about it's very intimate. But that intimate is not just, it's not just about getting angry in some senses. It's seeking to understand those worlds too, right? So what are the links between the anxieties of authority and heightened mediocrities?
Saurabh, eu só quero dizer para a audiência que vocês podem fazer perguntas pelo YouTube, nós estamos recebendo essas perguntas, né? O debate aqui não é um debate aberto, né? E eu acho que tem muitas pessoas assistindo e interessadas em perguntar diversas coisas para você, porque realmente essa possibilidade de trânsito, né, é algo que é muito bem-vinda para nós aqui, essa possibilidade de sair dos nossos lugares de circulação habituais. I'll take a while to wait for new questions, but I want to ask you. You were just saying we shouldn't take ourselves so serious, and I think in your presentation today, you lead us to a point that you can readdress the archive, you can readdress history, exactly because you don't take history so serious. You don't take the archive or the ultimate historical work as the final word in terms of research results. So there is an open-ended field for investigation. If you understand history as you say, as a political matter, but at the same time as something that levels, produces a kind of a leveling. If you think about how the Dalit history, for instance, in India has been readdressed and now is being forged through other kinds of knowledge production than the usual academic paper or something like that. So if you could talk about history as an open-ended field of query.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very important question. I think I've, apart from bringing in Savi as a part of the story of entitlement, privilege, and so on, bringing his art as a kind of a counterpoint, I think I've published my last essay on a Dalit subject other than Savi. And that's because it's something which has happened to the field. Dalits are themselves writing about it. I'm not that open-endedness which you speak about, the fact of the lack of certitudes which inhabit the archive. I mean, open-ended is very right, because archives are also places where romances happen, where breakups happen, where divorces happen, relationships are formed, people fight. There are all kinds of, they have, again, they have dust and they have ink and they have textures. So, the open-endedness actually is precisely about registering that, I find that because the new Dalit histories have to come from a certain point, which is radical, which is contending, which is challenging power, they come with their own certitudes. I understand those certitudes, okay? But I don't inhabit those certitudes. So what do? I think the better thing is, instead of being critical, I stopped writing. The last thing I wrote was, it's called Dalit Religions Redux, where I'm actually using prior anthropologies as archival materials. You can criticize a Dumont, you can criticize what was written earlier, but what if we actually read them in critically productive ways to point to what they were saying? What was wrong with them was not just with Dumont, it was with Nick Turks, who's liked very much because he said caste was completely about colonialism, etc., etc. So, can we actually read these? Can we read these anthropological archives? And one of the points, which, again, in an open-ended way, I got from someone who's not necessarily written about Dalits. This is the historian Niladri Bhattacharya in Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he's got this book, which has taken almost 40 years to come out, 35 years, 40 years. It's fantastic because what he's talking about are the village, not just the village wastes, but he's talking about scrubs. And what becomes clear is that caste as we know it, okay, including the subordination of Dalits, it existed. The caste in the way we know it actually came up was consolidated in the first half of the 19th century. And this had to do with structures and strictures of political economy. Now, you can't run away from that by making caste something which is only cerebral, which is about original slavery. I mean, go ahead and do it, but it's about making a certain claim of politics, which is not, which is coming up with its own closures. So I understand that, but, I don't inhabit those worlds of argument. I'm not going to criticize them. I'm not going to, but I'm also not going to participate in them. We've got other stories to tell.
Yeah, and what you bring now opens up a kind of a new consciousness on time again. You are very concerned about time. So usually, if you think about Brazilians looking towards India, what we think is that India has a long history, and that our history is so recent. But at the same time, as you were saying just now, if you deal with the archive in a critical way, in a fabulative way, in a creative way, maybe you can create coevalence between colonial or post-colonial experiences in countries that don't relate immediately, that we don't compare immediately, like Brazil, Mexico, or India. So I think that's very, very powerful and challenging in our present political moments, because we have to take into account that there are some of us who get together around issues like the BRICS, understanding that we have some commonalities, but these are commonalities in the field of political economy. But what you are bringing now is completely innovative and challenging for this scenario.
Well, thank you, Antonádia. But with the BRICS question, I'm reminded of our senior friend who no longer likes me very much, Walter Mignolo. So he was speaking in South Africa at Stellenbosch, and he had this big thing about BRICS. Okay, this would have been 2013, 2013. And, and he had his usual, what he says about the decolonial. So I thought I asked him about the not oneness of Europe. Okay, and as an example, I brought in, and this is a question of the archive and if history is being read. So as I brought in the question of immanence, right? Because Walter's thought is all about transcendence, right? It's all about, So I brought in the question of immanence, and I said, is there only one Europe? And I brought in the levelers and diggers, the nonconformist sects, from which Christopher Hill had written about and which deeply impressed me when I was in first year of college. But I also brought in someone who I understand only partially, but who speaks to me, Spinoza. So you know what Walter's answer was? Walter said, Saurabh, again, you've asked a historical question. I'm a philosopher. And the certitude of that, the aestheticization of his own arguments in cerebral ways. So it's not just the cerebral. When our arguments are aestheticized in favor of what we believe in without questioning that, I think there's a problem as well. This thing about power as dystopian and differences being necessarily good, there's a kind of an aesthetic about it. But okay, so about the BRICS. So I was a little flummoxed, but you don't want to say anything to that. He is, a few decades older, at least a couple of decades. But he was talking about BRICS, and I said, in terms of the political economy, China, the Chinese government is buying huge parts of Africa. They've installed themselves there, right? What's happening? India is not doing that in Somalia or Ethiopia, but you know what Indian billionaires are doing? They're buying large swathes of land there. This is the new sort of power of political economy, which I don't do research on, but you read stuff and you get it. So what kind of a world are you privileging? What notions of emancipation do you have? When you forget this and it all becomes a conceptual exercise that you're thinking of, the possible forms of solidarity. And, we have. But I wanted to go back also to what you were saying earlier, that, long history, but there are disjunctions in history. I don't see Indian histories as one kind of continuum. And in a like manner, long histories are not just about temporal chronologies or temporal markers. There are worlds which are contained in particular histories. Brazil is just as a foundry of settler colonialism and race is crucial, is absolutely crucial to understanding the forms of entitlement, privilege, some of which you work on, in understanding worlds today.
Yeah. What I really think is that if we take colonial history, and we rely on such a temporality that we stay the feeling is that we are kidnapped in this cage, and this is the colonial cage, the nation as the slot where
Yes.
we as academics, researchers, students, we stay. And when we talk about the people, and not just the people, but all those beings who were in India or in where Brazil is now, this sense of a continuous invasion of others' domains, and not just attributes that we transfer to others, but this kind of question in your work for me is very powerful. So we can address history, time, space, and we can think about ourselves in other than, for instance, you brought Mignolo, other than the decolonial perspective. So.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. You brought in a very, very important issue. We're constantly going on with the colonial and criticizing the colonial, which is important, but it's the sinews, not just the structures, but the sinews of colonial which need to be understood. And the colonial lives on in the nation, okay? In different ways in Brazil, in different ways. So the question is not just about the colonial, the question is about the nation. I mean, how are, what's this absolute, gigantic genocidal mess which we are a part of today? I think it's about the nation, right? Entirely imbricated with empire, entirely implicated with the colonial, right? But so there's this discussion, and there was an anthropologist there, Greek anthropologist, who sort of liked our last session, which was the only one actually on racisms and racializations. So I was talking about how there's a braiding of different kinds of knowledges. Disciplines of modernity are contradictory precisely because they are about the progressivist and the romantic. They're about hermeneutic and analytical. They're not one, okay? You can't. So the question came up, this anthropologist, she came up and said, all of it was very good, but I didn't like the critical discussion of Franz Boas, okay? Because what I was saying was that there's a certain romanticism of the 19th century kind, which Franz Boas has, which means that he can see the African American, as a subject who will move forward. But he cannot abide by the Native American. And that's not, it's a politics where he thinks that they're gone. Civilization will finish them. So there's actually a romanticism. But, as another panelist said, the thing is that for him, the African American was a subject of the American nation, and he'd left behind Germany, and he believed in that progressivist nation. That the African American was a subject of was a progressivist subject, because the African American was a subject of the assimilationist nation. It's assimilating. Okay, now that was a 1910s, 1920s vision, okay, or 1900s, 1910s. I'm not saying that, Boas was wrong but we can learn something from the fact of how, right, in his spirit, which is anti-colonial, he actually can, he sadly, in a romantic sense, he just has to accept the Native American, the demise of the Native American, right? At the end. So what are these? This is not to badmouth. This is not to abuse. It's to understand the history of anthropology, but to recognize in this case the figure, the formation of the nation as it haunts these imaginaries. And we can't get away from these histories by saying, oh, we're so clever, we do it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's I like the fact that you brought up Franz Boas, because Audra Simpson writes about the fact that white anthropologists love Franz Boas. No? Yeah. So I really like the fact that you bring him, because
Recording in progress.
The Brazilian case. So I think it's what you are bringing is very, very important for our present challenges in political terms.
Well, thanks. But there is another another sort of parallel which is going on here, because in terms of the nation, this is not criticizing Dalit politics, dismissing it. But the point is that, when it comes to middle class Dalit radicalism, middle class in the sense that people who are making claims on the state, they want to be a part of development. And that development is about the nation.
Yeah, okay. I think about Kaka, who once said that the development and the nation are the most challenging subjects for Dalit politics.
Well, they're challenging in the sense that there's a party. Who says this?
Kaka.
Kaka. Yeah. No, Kaka is fantastic. And I'm glad you brought in about racism as well. Actually, I wish I was having this conversation in this global racism thing with you rather than some of the guys I attended. But here's the thing. The point is that it's a challenge. Yes, I completely agree with Kaka on this and actually learn from him, because that is his point, actually, that, a certain Dalit radicalism wants to participate in the fruits of development. They want this thing. But what is happening to the indigenous? What is happening to the Adivasi? What is happening to the tribal in the Northeast? What's happening is that, particularly in large parts of peninsular India, what's happening is that it's the indigenous, it's the Adivasis, whose lands are being taken, whose forests are being taken, what exists under the ground, the bauxite, the iron ore, that is being extracted, and their airwaves also are gone, through these incredible, inextricable entanglements. And the other part of it was, sorry, I'm going back, but in terms of, can we juxtapose the figure of the Dalit and the figure of the indigenous, broadly speaking? Can we juxtapose them to ask different kinds of questions? In other words, can we actually hold together the colony and the nation? And in other words, it is about, you brought up Audra Simpson, it is very much about, I've learned a lot of, understood a lot about Boas from the history of anthropology of George Stocking Jr., right? And Stocking Jr. is himself a romantic. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Romantic in that sort of 19th, 20th century tradition. He finds in Boas a kind of a coming together of romanticism and progressivism, okay? And I would stay with that. It's a good way to read him. But I would read Stocking Jr. and Boas, keeping in view Audra Simpson as well. Why can't we do that? Why does it have to be this or that? Why can't it be this and that?
Yeah. Saurabh, I think we couldn't have a better discussion in this opening day of Unbox. We have no more questions from YouTube. Mm-hmm. So I really appreciate your time, the paper you sent us beforehand. I hope you share a further paper, your work with us on this subject you brought today. And I'm really thankful. And in the name of Unbox, we send you our best regards. We wish you were here, but I want to share with the audience that you will be here in Brazil in late November, and most of us will have the opportunity to be with you and to go back to this talk. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.